They whispered it in drawing rooms, over embroidered tea services, behind painted fans. Poor governess. Dorothea Hartley had grown accustomed to the pitying glances and the condescending smiles. She was the orphaned daughter of a country vicar, reduced to teaching the spoiled children of families who barely acknowledged her presence. But on that fateful autumn evening at Ashford Manor, when the candles flickered and all eyes turned toward the grand staircase, those same voices would fall silent. For standing in the doorway, with eyes like storm clouds and a title that commanded empires, was Benedict Blackwood, the Duke of Ashbourne, and he had come for her. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has travelled. The rain fell in sheets against the mullioned windows of Ashford Manor, a sprawling estate that sat like a jewel in the Derbyshire countryside. Inside, the fires blazed in every grate, casting dancing shadows across walls adorned with ancestral portraits and gilded frames. It was November of 1825, and Miss Dorothea Hartley, governess to the Ashford children, stood before the schoolroom window, her slender fingers pressed against the cold glass. She was 23 years old, with hair the colour of burnished chestnuts that she wore in a severe bun at the nape of her neck. Her eyes, a remarkable shade of amber flecked with green, held intelligence and depth that few bothered to notice. The dove-grey dress she wore was practical, modest, and utterly unremarkable, the uniform of her station. Beautiful, yes, but in a way that society deemed dangerous for a woman of her position, too striking to ignore, too poor to acknowledge. "Miss Hartley, you're wool-gathering again," came the sharp voice of 8-year-old Arabella Ashford, the eldest of the 3 children under Dorothea's care. The girl sat at her desk, quill poised over her copybook, her expression a perfect miniature of her mother's perpetual disapproval. Dorothea turned from the window with a practiced smile. "Forgive me, Arabella. I was merely observing the weather. Now shall we return to your French conjugations?" The hours passed as they always did. Latin declensions for young Thomas, arithmetic for 6-year-old Charlotte, deportment lessons for all. Dorothea moved through the routines with mechanical precision, her mind only half engaged. The other half wandered to places she dared not speak of, university lecture halls where ideas were debated freely, drawing rooms where her opinions might be solicited rather than tolerated, a life where she was more than invisible. When the clock struck 4, she dismissed the children to their nursemaid and descended the servants' stairs to take her solitary tea in the small chamber adjacent to the schoolroom. This was her world, suspended between the servants who resented her genteel manners and the family who found her presence necessary but distasteful. Mrs. Ashford, the mistress of the house, made her views abundantly clear. "A governess must know her place," she often proclaimed to her circle of friends during their afternoon visits. "Too educated and she becomes presumptuous. Too pretty and she becomes a danger. Miss Hartley is both, I'm afraid, but good governesses are difficult to find." Dorothea had overheard this pronouncement 3 weeks earlier, standing just outside the drawing-room door with a stack of the children's drawings Mrs. Ashford had requested to see. She had stood there, frozen, as the ladies tittered behind their teacups. That night, alone in her small attic room, she had wept, not from wounded pride, but from the suffocating realization that this was to be her entire existence. Her father, the Reverend Thomas Hartley, had been a scholar and a gentleman, though a poor one. He had educated Dorothea himself, filling her mind with Greek philosophy, English literature, and the revolutionary idea that women possessed intellects equal to men. When he died of consumption 2 years earlier, followed swiftly by her mother, Dorothea found herself alone in the world, with nothing but her education and her gentle birth to recommend her. The Ashfords had taken her on with the air of bestowing great charity. The master of the house, Sir Edmund Ashford, barely acknowledged her existence except to complain about the cost of maintaining a governess. His eldest son, however, Mr. Philip Ashford, aged 26, had noticed her altogether too much. His eyes followed her through corridors. His fingers found excuses to brush against hers when he visited the schoolroom, and his implications grew bolder with each passing week. "My dear Miss Hartley," he had said just last Tuesday, cornering her in the library, "surely you must find your position here rather lonely. A woman of your charms should have protectors, friends in higher places." His meaning had been unmistakable, his presumption insulting. She had extricated herself with icy politeness, but the encounter had left her shaken. She knew how these stories ended. A governess who rejected such advances found herself dismissed without a character reference. One who accepted them faced ruin. That evening, as November darkness fell early over the estate, Dorothea stood in her attic room, staring at her reflection in the small, tarnished mirror. The face that looked back at her was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes still burned with that dangerous thing, hope. Somewhere beyond these walls, there had to be more than this golden cage of propriety and silent suffering. Below, in the grand drawing room, she could hear the sounds of the family preparing for dinner, a meal she would not attend naturally. Governesses took their meals alone, but tonight Mrs. Ashford's shrill voice carried up the stairs with unusual excitement. "The Duke of Ashbourne!" she was exclaiming to her husband. "Edmund, do you understand what this means? An invitation to Lady Pemberton's autumn ball, and the Duke himself will be in attendance. They say he's finally looking to marry. If Philip could secure his friendship, or if the Duke were to notice our Charlotte when she debuts, the connections alone." Dorothea closed her door softly, blocking out the ambitious scheming. Dukes and balls were not for governesses. Her world was schoolrooms and attics, primers and patience. She picked up a worn copy of Wordsworth's poems, her father's last gift to her, and tried to lose herself in verses about daffodils and natural beauty. But that night, as she finally drifted to sleep, she dreamed of storm-grey eyes, and a voice that spoke her name not with pity or presumption, but with respect. She woke with tears on her cheeks, mourning a fantasy she would never live. The days that followed brought feverish preparation throughout Ashford Manor. Mrs. Ashford ordered new gowns, Sir Edmund grumbled about the expense, and Philip preened like a peacock, convinced his prospects were about to soar. The servants worked themselves to exhaustion, ensuring every Ashford would shine at Lady Pemberton's ball. Dorothea continued her duties, unaffected by the chaos. She would remain at the manor during the ball, naturally. Governesses did not attend society events. But as she watched Arabella's eyes light up at descriptions of the dancing and the music, something in Dorothea's chest ached, not with envy, but with the pain of denied possibility. On the eve of the great ball, Mrs. Ashford summoned Dorothea to her dressing room. The governess entered to find her employer seated before an ornate vanity, her face tight with calculation. "Miss Hartley," she began without preamble, "while we are attending Lady Pemberton's ball tomorrow evening, you will of course remain here with the younger children. I trust that is understood." "Of course, ma'am," Dorothea replied, her voice carefully neutral. Mrs. Ashford's eyes narrowed. "I want to be perfectly clear. You are not to entertain any notions above your station. My son has been foolish enough to pay you attention, but that will cease. A governess who forgets her place finds herself without employment. Am I understood?" The words struck like physical blows, but Dorothea kept her face composed. "Perfectly, ma'am. I have never entertained such notions." "See that you do not." Mrs. Ashford dismissed her with a wave of her hand, already turning back to her reflection. Dorothea climbed the stairs to her room, with lead in her heart. The walls of her cage had never felt so close, the bars never so unyielding. That night, she wrote a letter she would never send, pouring her heart onto paper, dreams of freedom, yearnings for respect, prayers for a life where she might be seen as more than poor governess. She sealed it and tucked it beneath her mattress, a secret testimony to a self the world would never know. Tomorrow, the Ashfords would attend their grand ball, and she would remain here, suspended in her half-life. The pattern would continue, unchanging and inescapable, or so she believed. Lady Pemberton's autumn ball was the pinnacle of Derbyshire society, held annually at Pemberton Hall, a magnificent estate that rivaled the grandest houses in England. The ballroom glittered with hundreds of candles reflected in crystal chandeliers, and the air hummed with music from a full orchestra. Ladies in silk gowns of every jewel tone swirled across the polished floor in the arms of gentlemen in immaculate evening dress. The Ashford family had arrived in their finest, Mrs. Ashford resplendent in purple satin, dripping with garnets that spoke more of ambition than taste. Philip strutted beside her, his cravat tied in an elaborate knot, his eyes scanning the room for advantageous connections. Sir Edmund followed behind, already calculating which card tables would yield the best returns. But the true anticipation centred on one figure, Benedict Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne, who stood near the far windows in conversation with Lord Pemberton himself. At 31, the Duke was everything society valued, titled, wealthy, powerful, and devastatingly handsome, in a way that suggested both privilege and purpose. His hair was dark as midnight, his features aristocratic and sharp, and those grey eyes held an intelligence that missed nothing. He had recently returned from 3 years abroad, touring the continent and studying agricultural innovations that he intended to implement on his vast estates. Unlike many of his peers, Benedict took his responsibilities seriously. He had inherited his dukedom at 25 upon his father's unexpected death, and had spent the intervening years transforming the Ashbourne holdings from profitable to exceptional. He had also earned a reputation for being dangerously perceptive and utterly unimpressed by social climbing. Matchmaking mamas found him frustratingly indifferent to their daughters' charms, though he was always impeccably polite. The Ashfords had no direct connection to the Duke, but Mrs. Ashford had schemed her way into an introduction through a distant cousin. As the evening progressed, she manoeuvred her family into his orbit with the subtlety of a battering ram. "Your Grace," she simpered, executing a curtsy that her corset barely allowed, "what an extraordinary honour to make your acquaintance. May I present my son, Mr. Philip Ashford? He has such admiration for your progressive estate management techniques." Benedict's expression remained courteous but cool. "Mr. Ashford." He nodded, his tone suggesting he saw precisely through the performance. Philip, however, was too self-absorbed to notice. "Your Grace, I've read accounts of your innovations with crop rotation. Fascinating stuff. At Ashford Manor, we also pride ourselves on forward thinking. In fact, what followed was a painful 15 minutes of Philip pontificating about agricultural matters he understood only superficially, dropping names and making claims that Benedict's slight frown suggested he found questionable at best. Mrs. Ashford beamed, oblivious, while Sir Edmund nodded along like a puppet. Benedict endured it with the patience of long practice until Lady Pemberton rescued him by announcing the supper dance. The Ashfords retreated, convinced they had made an excellent impression. They had not. Meanwhile, back at Ashford Manor, Dorothea sat in the schoolroom with young Thomas, who had developed a fever and required watching. She read to him from a storybook, her voice gentle, while the autumn wind howled outside. She tried not to think about the ball, about swirling skirts and music, about being invisible even in her own imaginings. A knock at the schoolroom door startled her. Mrs. Hodges, the housekeeper, entered with a troubled expression. "Miss Hartley, I'm afraid I must ask something unusual of you. Lady Pemberton has sent word. There's been a situation with the wine service, and she requires additional staff. Mrs. Ashford has instructed that you're to go to the hall immediately to assist. The second footman will watch young Master Thomas." Dorothea's heart lurched. "I'm to attend the ball." "No, miss. You're to work in the servant's capacity. Help in the supper room, that sort of thing. Mrs. Ashford was quite clear. You're to keep to the service areas and out of sight of the guests." The housekeeper's tone was apologetic. She, at least, recognized the humiliation inherent in the order. An hour later, Dorothea found herself at Pemberton Hall, dressed in her plain grey governess gown with a white apron tied over it, marking her as clearly as a brand, servant, not guest. She was directed to the supper room, where an elaborate buffet was being prepared. Her task was to ensure the serving dishes remained full, to fetch items from the kitchen as needed, to be useful and invisible. She moved through her duties mechanically, trying to ignore the sounds of music and laughter from the ballroom beyond. Through the open doorway, she caught glimpses of the glittering assembly, ladies she had once imagined herself among, when she was still her father's daughter and the world held possibility. Then she saw them, the Ashford family, entering the supper room in a cluster of self-importance. Philip held the arm of Miss Clarissa Thornton, a wealthy young lady whose dowry was legendary. They were laughing, his head bent close to hers in intimate conversation. Mrs. Ashford trailed behind, her expression triumphant. Dorothea turned away quickly, moving to the far end of the table, but Philip's voice carried clearly across the room. "The governess situation at home is rather amusing," he was saying to Miss Thornton and a small circle that had gathered. "We've this pretty little creature teaching the children, all golden eyes and tragic airs. Thinks herself quite the scholar, you know. Father's daughter was educated above her station." Laughter rippled through the group. Dorothea's hands froze on the serving spoon she held, her face burning. Mrs. Ashford joined in, her voice saccharine with false sympathy. "One does feel sorry for such girls. Poor Miss Hartley. She's really quite pitiful. No family, no fortune, no prospects beyond what we charitably provide. And yet she has such odd notions, reading poetry in 4 languages. What use is that to a governess, I ask you?" "Perhaps she imagines herself the heroine of a novel," Miss Thornton suggested with a cruel little laugh, "waiting for some gentleman to sweep her away to a better life." Philip's response was worse. "I've attempted to help her understand reality. A woman in her position should accept friendship where it's offered, but she has pride beyond her circumstances. Quite delusional, actually." The implication was clear, deliberate, and devastating. He was suggesting to society that Dorothea had rejected his advances out of misplaced arrogance, marking her as both presumptuous and ungrateful. In one casual conversation, he was destroying whatever reputation she possessed. Dorothea felt the room tilt. Around her, other servants had frozen, their faces carefully blank in the way of those who witnessed disaster but cannot intervene. She could feel eyes upon her, pitying, curious, entertained. She was the evening's accidental entertainment, the governess being put firmly in her place. She forced herself to move, to continue her duties, but her hands trembled. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she could not, would not, allow them to fall. Not here, not before these people. Mrs. Ashford's voice continued, rising above the ambient noise. "Of course, we'll keep her on as long as she proves useful. One must be charitable. But really, such girls must learn that this is the height of what they can expect from life. Service, gratitude, and humility. Anything else is simply absurd." The laughter that followed was the sound of Dorothea's dignity being shredded. She stood frozen beside the table, her amber eyes fixed on the damask tablecloth, her entire being focused on simply surviving the next moment and the next. Then, into that terrible laughter, came a voice like cold steel wrapped in velvet. "Indeed, how fascinating. Do continue, Mrs. Ashford. I find myself captivated by your philosophy on what women should expect from life." The room fell silent as death. Every head turned toward the doorway where Benedict Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne, stood with his arms crossed and his grey eyes like gathering storm clouds. His expression was one of such controlled fury that several people took an involuntary step backward. He had heard everything. The silence that followed Benedict's arrival stretched like a drawn bowstring. Mrs. Ashford's face drained of colour, then flushed an unattractive crimson. Philip straightened as if jerked by strings, his earlier swagger evaporating. Miss Thornton's cruel little smile froze on her face. Benedict moved into the room with the predatory grace of a man who commanded empires. His eyes swept the assembly, cataloguing and dismissing, until they landed on Dorothea. For a moment, just a heartbeat, something flickered in those grey depths. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he had not expected to find. "Your Grace," Mrs. Ashford stammered, attempting a curtsy that resembled a wobble. "We were we were discussing the persecution of vulnerable women in your employ," Benedict finished, his tone arctic. "Yes, I heard quite clearly, as I believe did half the guests in the ballroom. Excellent acoustics, Pemberton Hall." Lady Pemberton always did have an appreciation for fine architecture. The implication was clear. This humiliation had occurred within earshot of society's elite. The Ashfords' social ambitions had just immolated themselves. Philip foolishly attempted to salvage the situation. "Your Grace, surely you understand that governesses must be kept in their proper sphere. Miss Hartley is well treated in our home, but one must maintain appropriate boundaries." "Appropriate?" Benedict's voice could have cut glass. "You were describing in public your attempts to coerce a woman under your family's protection into accepting your unwanted attentions. You were mocking her education, her circumstances, and her integrity. Pray, tell me which part of that performance you believe appropriate." Philip's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around them, the assembled guests watched with the horrified fascination of those witnessing a public execution. This was scandal of the first order, a duke humiliating a respected family in full view of society. Benedict turned his attention to Dorothea, who still stood frozen beside the serving table, her face pale but her chin lifted with desperate dignity. "Miss Hartley, I presume." She managed a slight curtsy, though her legs felt like water. "Your Grace, I wonder if you might spare me a moment of conversation, in private." It was phrased as a request, but carried the weight of dual command. When a duke requested your time, you complied. Lady Pemberton, who had appeared in the doorway with the instincts of a hostess sensing disaster, immediately intervened. "Of course, Your Grace. Miss Hartley, please, the library is just through here. I shall accompany you as chaperone." Dorothea found herself guided through a service corridor and into a magnificent library, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes. Lady Pemberton, a sharp-eyed woman of 60 with a reputation for unconventional wisdom, shut the door firmly behind them. Benedict wasted no time on pleasantries. "Miss Hartley, I must ask you a direct question, and I require an honest answer. Has Philip Ashford or any member of that family made unwanted advances toward you, or placed you in a compromising position?" The directness of it, the simple assumption that her truth mattered, undid something in Dorothea. Tears she had held back now fell freely. "Yes, Your Grace. Mr. Ashford has been persistent. I have rebuffed him repeatedly, but Mrs. Ashford has made it clear that any complaint from me would result in dismissal without a character. I have nowhere else to go. My parents are dead. I have no family, no funds." Lady Pemberton produced a handkerchief, pressing it into Dorothea's hands with surprising gentleness. "You poor child. And tonight they deliberately humiliated you before society to ensure you could never rise above your station. Monstrous." Benedict's jaw tightened. "You will not return to Ashford Manor. That is settled, but I find myself in need of information. Lady Pemberton tells me you were educated by your father, a country vicar." Dorothea nodded, confused by the turn of conversation. "Yes, Your Grace. My father believed in educating daughters as thoroughly as sons. I read Latin and Greek, French and Italian. I've studied mathematics, natural philosophy, literature, and you're condemned to teaching manners to children whose parents have none," Benedict said flatly. He turned to Lady Pemberton. "Clara, you mentioned last month that your niece in Bath has been searching for a suitable companion, an intelligent woman to assist with her literary salon and correspondence." Lady Pemberton's eyes lit with understanding. "Agatha! Yes, perfect. She's been despairing of finding anyone with sufficient intellect and grace. She needs someone who can discuss philosophy as easily as poetry, someone comfortable in society but not overwhelmed by it." Would such a position interest you, Miss Hartley?" Benedict asked, his grey eyes steady on hers. Dorothea's heart hammered. Bath, a literary salon, a position of respect rather than servitude. Your Grace, I hardly know what to say. Such generosity— It is not generosity, Benedict interrupted. It is justice. You have been treated abominably. This merely sets right an imbalance. He paused, then added with unexpected warmth, and I suspect Lady Agatha will find in you exactly the companion she has been seeking. She has little patience for simpering misses and considerable appreciation for sharp minds. The arrangements were made with the efficiency of the wealthy and powerful. Lady Pemberton sent word to her niece that very night. The Ashfords were informed in terms that left no room for argument that Miss Hartley's employment with them was terminated immediately, and that any attempt to slander her would result in the Duke of Ashbourne's considerable displeasure, a threat that carried social and economic weight they could not ignore. Dorothea spent that night at Pemberton Hall, sleeping in a guest room far more luxurious than anything she had known in years. She lay awake in the darkness, her mind reeling. A duke had intervened on her behalf. A duke had seen the injustice and acted. It seemed impossible, fantastical, and yet it had happened. 3 days later, she arrived in Bath. Lady Agatha Weston was a widow of 55, possessed of independent wealth, sharp wit, and a passion for intellectual discourse that had made her home a gathering place for artists, writers, and progressive thinkers. She welcomed Dorothea not as a subordinate, but as a project of delightful potential. "My dear girl," she said, embracing Dorothea warmly upon her arrival, "Clara has written me all about that dreadful business. Forget it entirely. Here, you shall be my companion in every sense, friend, collaborator, and fellow conspirator against the forces of willful ignorance." The house on the Royal Crescent was filled with books, conversation, and a sense of possibility Dorothea had thought lost forever. Lady Agatha immediately set about outfitting her with a new wardrobe, nothing ostentatious, but gowns of quality and taste in colours beyond the greys and browns of governessing. "You have remarkable eyes," Agatha declared. "We shall dress you in amber silk and forest green. Let the world see you properly." Within a fortnight, Dorothea attended her first salon. The drawing-room was filled with poets, philosophers, a female novelist of some renown, and several gentlemen who discussed politics with a passion that would have scandalized the Ashfords. And there, seated near the fire in conversation with Lady Agatha, was a figure Dorothea recognized instantly. Dr. Elias Reed was the second son of a baronet, aged 34, who had shocked his family by pursuing medicine rather than the church. He had recently returned from Edinburgh, where he had studied the latest surgical techniques, and he possessed a mind as sharp as his scalpel. He was handsome in an unconventional way, lean and intense, with dark brown hair and eyes that looked at you as if you were a puzzle worth solving. "Ah, Miss Hartley," Lady Agatha called. "Come, let me introduce you to Dr. Reed. Elias, this is my new companion, Miss Dorothea Hartley. Dorothea, Dr. Reed has been boring me with talk of anatomy for 20 minutes. Perhaps you can distract him with something more civilized." Dr. Reed stood, bowing over Dorothea's hand, with a smile that held genuine warmth. "On the contrary, I find anatomy entirely civilized, but I suspect Miss Hartley might find my enthusiasms tedious. Tell me, Miss Hartley, what subjects capture your interest?" It was an invitation rather than a dismissal, and Dorothea found herself responding with an honesty she had long suppressed. "I confess a fascination with natural philosophy, Dr. Reed. My father encouraged me to read widely, and I found Mr. Dalton's atomic theory particularly compelling." His eyes lit with delighted surprise. "You've read Dalton? Remarkable. And what did you make of his proposals regarding compound atoms?" They talked for an hour, the conversation flowing from chemistry to physics to the philosophical implications of scientific discovery. Around them, the salon continued, but Dorothea was barely aware of it. Here was someone who listened, who engaged, who treated her thoughts as worthy of consideration. When the evening ended, Dr. Reed bowed again over her hand. Miss Hartley, I hope we shall continue this conversation at Lady Agatha's next gathering. It is rare to find someone who can discuss science with both knowledge and imagination. I should like that very much, Dr. Reed, Dorothea replied, and meant it with her whole heart. Later, as Lady Agatha helped her prepare for bed, the older woman smiled knowingly. Dr. Reed is a good man, unconventional, brilliant, and utterly unimpressed by social pretension. He sees worth where others see only pedigree. I merely enjoyed the conversation, Dorothea protested, but felt her cheeks warm. Of course, dear. As did he. Agatha patted her hand. Now sleep. Tomorrow we're visiting the lending library, and then you'll help me compose responses to the 17 invitations we've received. You're about to discover that Bath society is far more interesting than Derbyshire's limited offerings. That night, Dorothea fell asleep not with tears but with a tentative smile. For the first time since her parents' deaths, the future held something other than resigned endurance. It held possibility. And in London, Benedict Blackwood sat in his study, rereading the letter Lady Agatha had sent, reporting on Miss Hartley's successful integration into Bath society. He told himself his interest was merely that of a patron, ensuring a charitable act had succeeded. He told himself the memory of amber eyes bright with unshed tears was simply the natural reaction to witnessing injustice. He told himself he was not, in fact, finding excuses to visit Bath in the coming month. He was lying. Winter descended upon Bath with frost-painted mornings and evenings lit by lamplight and firelight. Dorothea's transformation was not one of circumstance alone, but of spirit. Lady Agatha's household offered what Ashford Manor never had: respect, intellectual stimulation, and the freedom to be herself. The shadows of humiliation gradually faded, replaced by confidence born of genuine acknowledgement. At the winter assembly in the upper rooms, Dorothea made her first public appearance as Lady Agatha's companion. She wore a gown of deep amber silk that brought out the gold in her eyes, her hair dressed in a softer style that framed her face with artless elegance. She looked, as Lady Agatha proudly declared, like the lady you were always meant to be. The assembly rooms glittered with Bath society, a more diverse and intellectual crowd than Derbyshire's rigid hierarchies had allowed. Here, wealth mixed with talent, titles mingled with merit, and here, entering just after the dancing began, was Benedict Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne. He had told himself this visit was business, consulting with agricultural reformers based in Bath, nothing more. He had not admitted, even in the privacy of his thoughts, that he had timed this visit to coincide with the assembly he knew Lady Agatha would attend. But when his eyes found Dorothea across the room, laughing at something Dr. Reed had said, something in his chest tightened with an emotion he was not yet ready to name. Lady Agatha, whose powers of observation rivaled any general's, noted his arrival immediately. "Your Grace," she called, gesturing him over with her fan. "What a delightful surprise. You know Dr. Reed, I believe, and of course you've met my companion, Miss Hartley." Benedict bowed, his eyes meeting Dorothea's with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Hartley, I trust Bath agrees with you?" "Exceedingly well, Your Grace," she replied, curtsying with a grace that would have astonished the Ashfords. "Lady Agatha has been extraordinarily kind." "Nonsense," Agatha interjected. "The girl is a treasure. My correspondence has never been so efficiently managed, and she can actually discuss the books in my library rather than merely dusting them. I'm entirely selfish in keeping her." Dr. Reed added with warm approval, "Miss Hartley has been educating us all on Dante's original Italian. Her translation insights have revolutionized my understanding of the Inferno." Something flickered in Benedict's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. "You translate Dante, Miss Hartley?" "My father insisted I learn languages in their original texts," Dorothea explained. "He believed translations often lost the poet's intended nuance." "Your father was a wise man." Benedict's voice held genuine respect. I should very much like to hear your thoughts on the Paradiso. Most focus on the Inferno's drama and miss the theological complexity of the final canticle. Dr. Reed glanced between them with growing interest, then tactfully excused himself to greet an acquaintance. Lady Agatha, less subtle, announced she needed refreshment and swept away, leaving Dorothea and Benedict in a bubble of privacy amid the crowd. "You've given me a second life, Your Grace," Dorothea said quietly. "I cannot adequately express my gratitude." "You owe me no gratitude," Benedict replied. "I merely ensured you received what you always deserved, respect and opportunity. What you've done with that opportunity is entirely your own achievement." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though I confess I am pleased to see you flourishing. The woman I met in that supper room was barely holding herself together. This woman before me now radiates confidence." "That woman was drowning," Dorothea admitted. "I had begun to believe their assessment of me, that I was indeed pitiable, presumptuous, worthless beyond my utility. You threw me a rope when I was going under for the third time." The music swelled around them. Benedict extended his hand. "Would you honor me with this dance, Miss Hartley?" It was a waltz, a dance still considered slightly scandalous, requiring the gentleman's hand at the lady's waist. Dorothea placed her gloved hand in his, and he led her onto the floor with effortless grace. They moved together as if they had partnered 100 times, the steps flowing naturally. "You dance beautifully," Benedict observed. "My mother taught me. She insisted that a gentleman's daughter should have all the accomplishments, even if she might never use them in ballrooms." Dorothea smiled sadly. "She never imagined I would become a governess." "You are not a governess anymore," Benedict said firmly. "You are Lady Agatha's companion. Welcome in the best drawing rooms. More importantly, you are yourself, undiminished and unashamed. Do not let the Ashfords' cruelty define your identity." His words, spoken with such conviction, touched something deep within her. "And who do you see when you look at me, Your Grace?" He met her eyes, and for a moment the ballroom faded away. "I see an intelligent woman who has survived circumstances that would have broken someone of lesser character. I see someone who reads Dante in Italian and discusses atomic theory with physicians. I see—" He paused, then finished quietly. "I see someone extraordinary." The waltz ended, but they remained standing in the middle of the floor for a heartbeat too long, the connection between them palpable. Then reality reasserted itself, and Benedict escorted her back to Lady Agatha with perfect propriety. But across the room, someone had witnessed the entire interaction with venomous interest. The Ashfords had come to Bath. Mrs. Ashford and Philip had arrived 2 weeks earlier, ostensibly for the winter season, but actually fleeing the social disaster that had engulfed them in Derbyshire. The Duke's public humiliation of their family had been discussed in every drawing room, embellished with each retelling until they were practically social pariahs. Bath offered the possibility of reinvention, or at least of obscurity. They had not expected to encounter Dorothea transformed into a lady, welcomed in society, dancing with the very Duke who had destroyed their reputation. Mrs. Ashford's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. Philip's was darker still, the rage of a man who believed he had been robbed of something he was owed. Beside him, his new companion, Miss Clarissa Thornton, watched with calculating eyes. Her legendary dowry had not yet secured her a husband, and she resented anyone who drew attention she believed was rightfully hers. "That governess creature," Clarissa hissed, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "dancing with the Duke as if she were his equal. The presumption is staggering." Mrs. Ashford, sensing an ally, leaned in conspiratorially. "She always had notions above her station. We tried to guide her toward appropriate humility, but she was stubborn. One cannot help but suspect she used methods to secure the Duke's patronage." The implication was ugly, deliberate. Around them, fans fluttered and eyes gleamed with potential scandal. This was the danger of society. Reputations could be built or demolished with whispered words. But Lady Agatha had not survived 5 decades of social warfare by accident. She materialized at Dorothea's side with the force of a one-woman army, her voice carrying with aristocratic clarity. "How amusing," she announced to no one in particular but everyone in general, "to see the Ashford family attempting to show their faces after that mortifying display at Pemberton Hall. One would think they would have retreated to the countryside out of sheer shame. But then, shame requires self-awareness, and some people are woefully lacking in that virtue." The surrounding conversations stopped dead. This was open warfare. Mrs. Ashford sputtered. "Lady Agatha, I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Agatha's eyebrows rose with devastating effect. "Then allow me to refresh your memory. You were overheard publicly humiliating a young woman in your employ, mocking her education and circumstances, while your son bragged about attempting to coerce her into inappropriate relations. The Duke of Ashbourne witnessed the entire shameful display and intervened to protect Miss Hartley from further abuse. The story has been told in every respectable drawing room from Derbyshire to London. You are, in short, infamous for all the wrong reasons." Philip stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "That is slander. Miss Hartley misrepresented—" "Be very careful what you say next, Mr. Ashford," came Benedict's voice, cold as winter steel. He had moved to stand beside Lady Agatha and Dorothea, his presence a bulwark against their accusers. "I was present. I heard every word you spoke, and I will testify to it before any authority you choose. Now I suggest you remove yourself from Miss Hartley's vicinity before I am forced to ask the Master of Ceremonies to eject you from these rooms for harassment." The threat hung in the air, backed by the full weight of ducal authority. Around them, society watched with bated breath. This was the moment. Would the Ashfords retreat, or would they push further and risk complete social annihilation? Mrs. Ashford, for all her faults, possessed survival instincts. She dropped a rigid curtsy. "Your Grace, we meant no offence. Come, Philip, Clarissa, we have other engagements." They retreated, but the look Philip cast over his shoulder at Dorothea was poisonous with unfinished business. Dr. Reed, who had observed the confrontation from nearby, moved to join them. "Well done, all of you, though I suspect we haven't seen the last of that particular unpleasantness." "Let them try," Lady Agatha declared. "Dorothea is under my protection now, and through me she has connections they can only dream of. They are nothing. She is everything they pretended to be." Benedict caught Dorothea's eye. "Are you well, Miss Hartley?" She nodded, though her heart still raced. "I am, Your Grace, thank you again." "You thanked me already," he said softly. "Now it is simply my privilege to stand beside you." The evening continued, but something had shifted. Dorothea had been publicly defended by a duke, claimed as companion by one of Bath's most respected women, and supported by a respected physician. She had, in effect, been elevated from invisibility to visibility of the most positive kind. As the assembly ended, Benedict made a decision he had been circling for weeks. He approached Lady Agatha and Dorothea as they prepared to depart. "Lady Agatha, Miss Hartley, I wonder if I might call upon you tomorrow afternoon. There is a matter I wish to discuss." Lady Agatha's eyes gleamed with knowing mischief. "Of course, Your Grace. We shall expect you at 3. As they rode home in the carriage, Agatha squeezed Dorothea's hand. "My dear girl, I believe your life is about to change again." "How can you possibly know that?" Dorothea asked. "Because I recognize the look in that duke's eyes," Agatha replied with satisfaction. "It's the look of a man who has found something worth claiming, and I suspect he's about to do exactly that." Dorothea's heart fluttered with hope and terror in equal measure. Surely Lady Agatha was mistaken. Dukes did not court companions, no matter how transformed. Did they? Tomorrow she would have her answer. Benedict arrived at Lady Agatha's home precisely at 3, bearing a bouquet of winter roses that must have cost a small fortune in the off-season. He was shown into the drawing-room, where Dorothea and Agatha awaited, the afternoon light streaming through tall windows and casting everything in soft gold. "Your Grace." Agatha greeted him with barely concealed glee. "How punctual, and what lovely roses. Dorothea, dear, why don't you arrange those in water while the Duke and I have a brief word?" It was an obvious maneuver, but Dorothea complied, stepping into the adjacent morning room, where she could hear their murmured conversation but not make out specific words. Her hands trembled as she arranged the roses, their scent filling the air with promise. After 5 minutes that felt like hours, Lady Agatha called her back. "Dorothea, the Duke has something he wishes to ask you. I shall be in the library, just through that door, should you need me. For propriety's sake, we'll leave it ajar." And then, with the grace of a skilled tactician, she withdrew. Benedict and Dorothea stood facing each other across the elegant drawing room. He looked uncharacteristically uncertain, this man who commanded estates and influenced Parliament. He gestured to the settee. "Will you sit, Miss Hartley? What I have to say may take some time." They sat, a respectable distance between them, yet Dorothea felt the air itself vibrate with anticipation. "I have given considerable thought to how to approach this conversation," Benedict began, "and I find myself uncharacteristically at a loss for words, so I shall simply speak plainly and trust in your intelligence to understand my meaning." He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes intense with emotion held carefully in check. "When I encountered you in that supper room at Pemberton Hall, being publicly humiliated, my first reaction was anger at the injustice. I intervened because it was the right thing to do, or so I told myself. But in the weeks since, I have found myself unable to stop thinking about you, about your courage under duress, about the intelligence that shines from your eyes, about the way you discuss Dante and atomic theory with equal passion." Dorothea's breath caught. "Your Grace." He held up a hand gently. "Please, let me finish before I lose my nerve. I have watched you transform from a woman barely surviving to a woman thriving. But the transformation was not in you. It was merely that circumstances finally allowed the world to see what was always there. You are remarkable, Dorothea, and I find that I do not wish to return to London and resume my life without you in it." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. "I am not asking this because I pity you, or out of some sense of obligation. I'm asking this because in you I have found something I was not even aware I was searching for, a partner of intellect and character, a woman who can stand beside me not as ornament, but as equal." He opened the box to reveal a ring, a sapphire the color of midnight sky, surrounded by diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. "Miss Dorothea Hartley, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, of becoming the Duchess of Ashbourne?" The world seemed to stop spinning. Dorothea stared at the ring, at Benedict's face, at the impossible reality unfolding before her. A duke was proposing marriage to her, the poor governess who had been mocked and humiliated mere months ago. She struggled to find words. "Your Grace, I am overwhelmed, but I must understand. You barely know me. We have spent perhaps a dozen hours in total conversation. How can you be certain?" "I have spent my adult life reading people," Benedict interrupted gently, "managing estates, negotiating with Parliament, dealing with tenants and stewards and ambitious climbers. I have developed instincts about character that rarely mislead me. When I met you, even in your lowest moment, I saw strength and dignity. In the weeks since, every interaction has confirmed my initial assessment. You are intelligent without being arrogant, educated without being pedantic, kind without being weak. You treat servants with respect and face adversaries with courage. These are the qualities I value." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something more intimate. "And if I am honest, there is more. When you smile, it feels like sunlight breaking through clouds. When you speak of ideas that excite you, your entire being radiates passion. I want to spend my life giving you reasons to smile, subjects to discuss, security to be fully yourself. I want to see that light in your eyes every morning. I want you, Dorothea, not as charity, as choice." Tears spilled down Dorothea's cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. "I never imagined. After everything, I never thought that you deserved happiness, Benedict asked softly. You do, more than most, and I would very much like to be the man who provides it. He paused, vulnerability flickering across his features. Unless you do not, unless Dr. Reed or someone else has captured your affections, I would not presume. No, Dorothea said quickly. Dr. Reed is a friend, nothing more. There is no one else. She took a shaky breath. There is only you, and that terrifies me because this feels like a dream, and I am afraid of waking. Benedict took her hand in his, the touch sending warmth through her entire body. Then let us make it real. Say yes, Dorothea. Be my Duchess, be my partner, be my wife. She looked at him, this powerful man who had seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up, who valued her mind as much as anything else, who was offering her not just security, but partnership. She thought of her parents, who had raised her to believe she deserved respect. She thought of the months of humiliation at Ashford Manor. She thought of the woman she had become in Bath, reclaiming herself. And she thought of the future unfolding before her, full of possibility. Yes, she whispered, then stronger. Yes, Your Grace. I would be honored to marry you. The smile that broke across Benedict's face was transformative. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if destined, then raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise. Benedict, he said, when we are private, please call me Benedict. Benedict, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue, and smiled through her tears. Lady Agatha burst through the library door with suspicious promptness, suggesting she had been listening at the keyhole. Well, do I call for champagne or fortify the poor girl with brandy? Champagne, Benedict announced, standing and drawing Dorothea up beside him, his arm possessively around her waist. Lady Agatha, I am delighted to inform you that Miss Hartley has accepted my proposal. We are engaged. Agatha let out a whoop that was decidedly unladylike and remarkably joyful. I knew it. The moment I saw you together at the assembly, I told myself, Agatha, that Duke is a goner. And I was right. Oh, my dear girl, a duchess. Your father would have been so proud. The champagne appeared with remarkable speed, clearly prepared in advance, and they toasted to the future. Dr. Reed was summoned and offered his sincere congratulations with genuine warmth. She's far too good for you, Ashbourne, he said with a grin, but I trust you're aware of that. Acutely, Benedict replied, his eyes never leaving Dorothea's face. The news spread through Bath society with the speed of wildfire. By evening, everyone knew that the Duke of Ashbourne had proposed to Lady Agatha's companion, the former governess elevated to Duchess-to-be. The gossip ranged from romantic approval to envious speculation, but the dominant narrative was clear. It was a love match. A duke had chosen merit over pedigree, intelligence over dowry, character over connections. The Ashfords heard the news in their rented rooms. Philip threw a decanter against the wall in impotent rage. Mrs. Ashford took to her bed with vapours. Miss Clarissa Thornton dissolved her tentative understanding with Philip immediately. There was no advantage in associating with a family whose former governess had ascended so far above them. But their reactions were irrelevant. They had become footnotes in a story that was no longer about them. Benedict and Dorothea walked along the Royal Crescent that evening, properly chaperoned by Lady Agatha at a discreet distance. The winter air was crisp, their breath forming clouds, and Dorothea's hand rested in the crook of Benedict's arm. I want to do this properly, Benedict said. A full London season engagement if you wish, though I confess I would prefer to marry sooner. Spring, perhaps. At Ashbourne Castle, it's in Northumberland, wild and beautiful. I think you'll love it. I would marry you tomorrow if propriety allowed, Dorothea admitted. But spring at Ashbourne Castle sounds like a dream. He stopped walking, turning to face her under the lamplight. I will spend my life ensuring you never doubt your worth again. I will stand beside you, behind you, wherever you need me. You will be my Duchess, but more importantly, you will be yourself, encouraged, celebrated, and cherished. She reached up to touch his face, wonder in her eyes. How did you become so wise? I merely recognized wisdom when I encountered it, he he replied, covering her hand with his. You've taught me that true nobility has nothing to do with birth and everything to do with character. I am the one being elevated by this marriage, Dorothea. Never forget that. They walked on, planning a future that seemed impossibly bright. Behind them, Lady Agatha smiled to herself, well satisfied with her matchmaking, and above them the stars wheeled in their courses, indifferent to human dramas, but somehow seeming to shine more brightly on this particular evening. Spring arrived at Ashbourne Castle in a riot of wildflowers and new green growth. The castle itself was a magnificent sprawl of medieval stone and Tudor additions, perched on the Northumberland cliffs with views of the sea that took Dorothea's breath away. She had arrived a week before the wedding to oversee final preparations, accompanied by Lady Agatha and an army of servants who treated their future duchess with warmth and genuine excitement. The wedding itself was both intimate and grand. Family and close friends filled the castle's private chapel, while hundreds of tenants and locals gathered in the grounds to celebrate. Dorothea wore a gown of ivory silk embroidered with gold thread, her hair dressed with pearls and orange blossoms. As she walked down the aisle toward Benedict, who waited with an expression of such profound joy, it made her own eyes fill with tears. She felt the ghosts of her past finally release their hold. She was no longer poor Dorothea Hartley, invisible governess. She was Dorothea Blackwood, Duchess of Ashbourne, beloved wife and respected partner. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but the looks they shared held promises that went far beyond the liturgy. Promises of partnership, respect and love built on the firmest possible foundation. The wedding breakfast was a joyous affair, filled with laughter and music. Dr. Reed attended and gave a toast that brought the room to tears, and then laughter. Lady Agatha proclaimed herself the best matchmaker in England and demanded credit for the entire affair. Even Benedict's mother, the Dowager Duchess, a formidable woman who had initially been skeptical, had been won over completely by Dorothea's grace and intelligence. "Welcome to the family, my dear," she said, embracing Dorothea warmly. "I confess I had reservations about Benedict choosing so unconventionally, but within 5 minutes of conversation with you, I understood completely. You are precisely what this family needs: fresh perspective, genuine kindness, and a brain that actually functions. The last 3 duchesses of Ashbourne were decorative but vapid. You are a vast improvement." That night, as fireworks lit the sky over the castle grounds in celebration, Benedict and Dorothea stood on the balcony of their private chambers, his arms wrapped around her from behind, her head resting against his chest. "Happy, wife?" he murmured into her hair. "Deliriously," she replied. "Though I keep expecting to wake and find myself back in that attic room at Ashford Manor, this entire year revealed as an elaborate dream." "If you do, I shall find you there and rescue you all over again," Benedict promised, "though I suspect you would have rescued yourself eventually. You're remarkably good at surviving." "I don't want to merely survive anymore," Dorothea said, turning in his arms to face him. "I want to live, fully, passionately, purposefully, and I want to do it with you." His kiss was her answer, and it promised everything. The months that followed were a revelation. Dorothea threw herself into her new role with enthusiasm and intelligence that surprised even Benedict. She reorganized the castle's extensive library, established a school for tenant children, shocking the locals until they saw the results, and began corresponding with agricultural reformers about innovations that could benefit the estate's farms. She also became Benedict's true partner in managing the dukedom. He consulted her on tenant disputes, asked her opinion on investment opportunities, and brought her to meetings with his stewards and solicitors. Initially, the men were skeptical. Women did not typically involve themselves in such matters. But Dorothea's sharp questions and practical suggestions quickly won them over. "Your Grace has a remarkable head for figures," the chief steward admitted, after she identified an accounting error that had gone unnoticed for months. "And an even better instinct for people. You were absolutely right about reassigning that farmland." In London for the parliamentary season, Dorothea hosted salons that became famous for their intellectual caliber. Poets mingled with politicians, scientists debated with philosophers, and the Duchess of Ashbourne presided over it all with grace and wit. She became known not as Benedict's pretty wife, but as a force in her own right. Lady Agatha visited often and took shameless credit for everything. "I told you she was extraordinary," she would announce to anyone who would listen. "Best decision I ever made," introducing her to Benedict. Dr. Reed married a fellow physician, a pioneering woman doctor who had studied in Paris, and they remained close friends with Benedict and Dorothea, their children eventually playing together in Ashbourne Castle's gardens. One afternoon in their second year of marriage, as autumn painted the Northumberland landscape in golds and crimsons, Dorothea sat in the castle library working on a translation of Dante she had been commissioned to complete. Benedict entered and found her surrounded by books and papers, her hair slightly disheveled, ink on her fingers, completely absorbed. He stood in the doorway, watching her with an expression of such profound contentment that when she finally looked up and saw him, she laughed. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am the luckiest man in England," he replied, moving to sit beside her. "That I found you when you most needed finding, but more importantly, that you chose me when you could have chosen anyone." "There was never anyone else," Dorothea said softly. "From that moment in the supper room when you defended me, no earlier than that, from that first moment you looked at me and saw me, really saw me, not as governess or ornament but as myself. That was when I began to love you, though I didn't recognize it then." "And now," Benedict asked, taking her ink-stained hand in his, "now I love you more each day. You gave me not just a title or security, but something infinitely more valuable. You gave me myself, the freedom to be fully who I am, without apology or diminishment. That is the greatest gift imaginable." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and the translation of Dante was abandoned for the afternoon. As for the Ashfords, they faded into obscurity. Philip eventually married a merchant's daughter for her fortune, a match of convenience that satisfied no one. Mrs. Ashford lived another 20 years, growing increasingly bitter as she watched that Governess creature become one of the most respected duchesses in England. Sir Edmund died of apoplexy at a card table, having gambled away most of the estate. Miss Clarissa Thornton married eventually, but her legendary dowry could not purchase the prestigious match she had dreamed of. She settled for a minor baronet and spent her life regretting the opportunities lost. Their fates, while not tragic, were characterized by a mediocrity of spirit that was perhaps the truest justice. They had sought greatness through superficial means and discovered that greatness cannot be purchased or inherited. It must be earned through character. On Dorothea's 30th birthday, as she and Benedict walked along the cliffs near Ashbourne Castle, with their 3 children running ahead, 2 daughters with their mother's amber eyes and a son with his father's dark intensity, she stopped and looked back at the castle, then out at the sea. "Do you ever think about how different life could have been?" Benedict asked, reading her thoughts as he so often did. "I think about it every day," Dorothea replied. "I think about that terrified girl in the attic room, and I wish I could go back and tell her, 'Hold on, survive this, because something extraordinary is coming.' I think about my parents and how proud they would be. I think about Lady Pemberton's ball and that moment when I thought my life was ending, not realizing it was actually beginning." She turned to look up at her husband, the man who had seen her worth when the world dismissed her, who had offered her not rescue but partnership, who had loved her not despite her past but inclusive of it. "I think about all of that," she continued, "and I am grateful. Not because I became a duchess, titles are just words, but because I became myself, fully and without apology, because I found love that sees and celebrates me. Because I learned that true nobility comes from within, and no circumstance can diminish it if we refuse to let it." Benedict pulled her close, his children's laughter echoing around them. You were always a duchess, Dorothea. You were always noble. The world just needed time to notice. No, she corrected gently. I needed time to believe it myself. You gave me that time, that space, that belief. Everything else follows from that. Mum, as the sun set over the North Sea, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Dorothea Blackwood, Duchess of Ashbourne, stood surrounded by the life she had built from ashes. She was beloved, respected, and fulfilled. She had bloomed not because she was transplanted to better soil, but because she had finally been given light and water and the freedom to grow. The poor governess they had whispered about was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth, and in knowing it, had claimed it, not through title or marriage, but through the unshakable conviction that she deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be celebrated exactly as she was. That was her triumph. That was her victory. That was her truth, and it was glorious. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear which part resonated most with you and where in the world you're listening from. Your support helps stories like Dorothea's travel further than we ever imagined possible. Until next time, remember, true nobility comes from within, and no circumstance can diminish it when we refuse to let it. Thank you for listening.